Hello, and welcome to Locutors of Trek, the podcast where we talk about the people, places, and things of Star Trek. So, replicate yourself a Romulan ale or your synthesis selection of choice and join us far beyond the stars.
Locutors of Trek.
Program initiated. Enter when ready.
Greetings, auditors of Trek. It is I, Davan.
And I, Dave.
And we, plain simple tailors.
Indeed.
Tonight's theme is culture. So sit back as we delight you all with an hour and a half, roughly, of discussion on bacteria.
But I mean, it's good you mentioned that, though, because if you want to take it right to ground, the word culture comes from the Latin cultus, which can both mean a set of practices, like, the cultus of Jupiter or, Diana the Huntress. But it could also mean cultus in terms of what grows, what we cultivate. So, culture in that sense is, what happens in this Petri dish as opposed to that Petri dish. And the Petri dish could be a little glass thing, or it could be a world or a star system.
I like that as a thesis for this episode.
All right.
We didn't know what that was going to be.
That's true. That's true. Although, I think it's also important to think about how Star Trek as a sort of way of doing science fiction, maybe a science fiction culture in itself, has dealt with the concept of culture over time. And I think we may even find differences as we look back and forth. Mm-hmm.
Oh, transport alert.
What's that?
It's Mr. Scott.
Good afternoon.
No relation.
Ahoy.
Ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls, fans of all shapes and hues.
Scott is here. He was wonderful enough to host our Trouble with Trivia segment.
Indeed.
The Trouble with Trivia, I believe.
That's true. It's the Trouble with Trivia.
The Quizmaster is correct.
Already taken over the segment. I like that.
Show's initiative.
So this is the show where the points don't... No, wait, that's somebody else.
Points kind of matter.
The points do matter to me.
I may change my opinion as
I
we
think
go
what you're
along.
trying to say is that this is the point at the show where we see if your hosts do indeed know what they're talking about.
Whew.
You chose the subject. We'll see
that's
how
true.
in-depth we can go.
I accept the challenge.
Let's do it.
All right. Gents, I've got a series of questions for you. Some of these are your classical trivia questions. They have a certain yes or no, correct or incorrect response. I will not be shy to tell you if you're incorrect. And I'll heap praise where appropriate.
Oh,
I love appropriate praise.
We do
I love
also
heaps.
have questions that aren't as cut and dry, where you've got... I'm looking to see... So I've listened to the beginning of this show. I was impressed with some of the in-depth takes and the uncommon points of view that have been expressed this far. I'm looking to see your takes on a few different questions, which we'll get to in due course.
Sounds
right on.
To
very
begin with,
exciting.
I'm gonna try and alternate between the two of you as we go here. I don't have any particular questions that I think will be easier or more difficult for one or the other of you. But to start with, we'll start with a toss-up. So I want to see, and this one we'll see.
Should we make a specific noise when you have an answer, or?
I think if you just give me the answer
Okay, great.
when you have the
That will
answer.
be the noise I make.
And if there's none, then we're off to a poor start, and we'll try again.
Are you also the points master, or should I be writing this?
No, I got a pen.
Okay, pen master.
The pen he does all his work with.
I got a pen and a piece of paper. I came prepared for this.
Woohoo!
We're not even that prepared.
Replicated himself
All right.
all sorts of writing implicants.
Gentlemen, the ship on lower decks is the USS Cerritos.
Uh-huh.
What class of ship is the Cerritos?
That is the California class.
It is
Oh,
indeed
nicely
a California class. Davin, you're going to take the start. We're going to go through some questions that are straight up yes or no, incorrect or correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I've got a two-parter, so I'm going to give you part one.
Okay.
I'm going to hand it over to Dave for part two.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
The
You get
Enterprise
to be
D.
the second part of a two-parter. That's always the best part.
We might even, if
I
you
conclude.
don't get this, you can steal your points. In fact,
Ooh, let's do it. I love stealing points.
Oh,
the Enterprise D, throughout the course of the show, had about 40 or so named shuttles that showed up in dialogue or in different screens in the background,
okay.
and they were pretty consistent through the 7 years.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't perfect, but they were pretty consistent at keeping to a naming convention. What was that naming convention?
Was it United States, like states? Like they had the Rhode Island.
I'm sorry to say, but the Rhode Island was actually a ship that showed up in Voyager in the future
Oh,
timeline.
no, you're right.
Oh.
Davin is incorrect. Can we have a early thieving of points?
I'm worried
Oh,
I'm
can I
conflating
steal it
this
back?
because
Yeah, good
of
shot.
the Galileo 7, but I think it was historical figures.
It was
is.
indeed historical figures.
There was the Sakharov I was trying to think.
We've got
Oh,
a
very
steal.
nice. I would not have thought of that one at all.
Now, don't keep giving
Yeah.
each other additional names. So
Oh.
we've got the Galileo, we've got the
Okay.
Sakharov. I want 2 more names.
Einstein.
Einstein's good. Was Nabokov one of their shuttles?
Nabokov, I don't think shows on the list.
Copernicus.
Copernicus does. Yeah, so
Dang,
we're
yeah.
going to say Davin gets his points back at the end,
Nicely
but Dave's
done.
on the board there.
Stole from myself.
We've got an early lead.
Backsies allowed.
Dave,
Okay.
this is a similar flavor of question. Deep Space Nine,
Okay.
on their show, ran through at least 10 different named
Mm-hmm.
runabouts. And Kira actually called this out specifically at one point.
Mm-hmm.
What was the naming convention for them?
It's Terran Rivers.
Exactly right. And can you name 2 of them?
Danube, Yangtze, Kian.
I will take it. That's 2 for
All
Dave.
right. I love the Danube class runabout. Just one of my
Me too.
favorite subcraft. Well, a starship in its own right, just kind of a miniature one. Anyway,
What 2 did you say?
Danube and Yangtze, Kian.
Yeah, those are the good ones.
Yeah. There's Rio Grande
There's the Rio
also
Grande, right.
that they do a lot of stuff with.
Give you a bonus point if one of you gets this. What was Kira's line that she mentioned about this?
About,
About the number of runabouts that they had.
oh, it's a good thing Earth has so many rivers.
That's exactly it. I think that's a verbatim it. I don't have the quote in front of me, but that's it. Yeah.
That's verbatim.
Well played,
I will
sir.
tell you that is verbatim.
Similar kind of question. We'll do this one as a toss-up as well. Go back in time. Forward for us, backwards from where we were talking.
Dang.
What naming convention did Starfleet use for the NX class of ships?
Oh,
Use British naval ships, I think, didn't it? Or is it American naval ships?
You're on the right path, but you're not right. Can you steal?
Oh,
well, I know the one after Enterprise is called Columbia.
Yeah. Which relates in what way? It's kind of an interesting
To
answer, too.
Enterprise.
oh
Yeah.
no, dang. It's after space shuttles, isn't it?
It's after space
Yeah.
shuttles, the first space
Space
shuttles that
shuttles.
launched. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because the Space Shuttle Enterprise, of course, was named after the USS Enterprise
Yeah.
from the original series. Kind of little Ouroboros going on there
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, eh?
between reality
I like that a
and the
lot.
scripted show. Okay. The Enterprise, very famously, is NCC 1701. What was, I'm going to give this to you, Davin, since it's your favorite. What was the Defiance
They
registry
prefer-
number?
Oh,
Well, that's not what the question is. We're going to say that's -1
oh
point.
no! I lost
Oh,
Fair,
I'm catching up.
He can do that. All right. What was your question?
You didn't even listen to the question after
I
this.
didn't know. I was
That might-
focused on my punchline.
I won't do it. I'm tempted to minus another one.
Oh my.
Registry number of the USS Defiant.
Oh God. 13071.
That's not even close.
It's 5 numbers. I know.
It is 5 numbers, yeah.
I thought it was like a 767,
Yeah, you're a lot nearer.
but I
It's
couldn't tell you the
NX.
last 2.
NX
It was an
because it's
NX?
because
Oh,
it was
'cause
a
it was a-
prototype ship.
right.
NX 74205.
74205.
I was so close.
Dave, how about the Voyager?
Voyager? Oh, no idea. Jeepers.
They didn't hammer this nearly as hard with any other ship.
It's
Voyager.
like a 514, actually.
Except maybe
I'm not sure.
the
I
original Enterprise.
do not know the Voyager.
You're also on the right path, but not quite right. NCC 74656.
74656. Wow.
Let's do a back and forth here. So there were a few different named Galaxy class ships that we saw throughout. The Enterprise does not count. I'm interested in some of the others. So
Ah.
Dave is currently leading the score here. Davin, we'll give this to you first.
This
give
is
me
a
another
surprise to me.
I
another
had
named
points
Galaxy
stolen
class
from
ship.
Oh, that's right.
Another named Galaxy class ship.
The Wellington. Was it not?
No.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
the,
well, hold on. You had your chance.
okay.
Dave?
The ill-fated Yamato?
The Yamato, the sister ship of the USS Enterprise, did not last out of the first season.
No.
Very dramatic moment.
Oh, it's a pretty crazy moment when
Yeah.
it
Catches your
Oh, I
attention
just
for
thought
a
of, like,
show that
3
wasn't
more.
that great. Okay,
All
well,
right.
Oh, there's the Venture.
the Ventures one, yeah.
There's also.
Well, hold up.
The Galaxy.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
It was
that
the,
was the
prototype
prototype.
of
Indeed.
the. Yeah.
There's also the Melbourne, was it not?
The Melbourne was not Galaxy class.
Melbourne was not in Bass. What's the one? An Excelsior, wasn't it? I think because it was a Melbourne at least was destroyed at Wolf 359.
May have been in. I'm not going to tell you because it's going to come up later.
Oh, okay.
You're up 2-1 in this section, Dave. You want to get another point here?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think of another Odyssey.
Odyssey is
Odyssey
another
was
one.
destroyed in Deep Space Nine in the Gamma Quadrant.
Yeah, it was. It was destroyed in the end of season 2 of Deep Space Nine, which happened to line up with the end of TNG, end of season 7 of TNG.
Right on.
And it was a bit of a moment. I don't know if they obviously didn't call us out in the show. I don't know if they did this in the production or if it ever came up anywhere, but it was a very nice little moment for Deep Space Nine to say, all right, forget about those guys. This ship looks just like the Enterprise. We're going to be in awe of it like the Enterprise, and we're going to just have the Dominion destroy it in no time at all.
Oh,
While
they
the
really do.
runabouts, which are spinning around, and very nice shot, the runabouts look tiny underneath the saucer section of the ship. Really nice shot. They destroy it, and that's the end of TNG. TNG, of course, would also destroy the Enterprise a couple months later
Indeed.
in Generations.
And every movie after that.
Enterprise had a rough run in the movies. You're down big time here, Davin. There's a couple
Oh,
of ships
my.
left.
Oh, no. Dave usually gets me on the ships.
Goodness me.
All right, so that's a
Yeah,
pass.
I couldn't tell you what any of the other Galaxy.
I thought for
ships
sure the
were.
Wellington was one of
The
them.
Challengers one and the Magellan was a so-so one.
that's
It was
cut, I
thought
think.
to be, but not a sure thing.
Okay.
So that's going to be 3 for Dave. Davin, you're back up to 2 at least. You didn't go down that time.
You can go down for shooting my mouth off or whatever. Go out and sit by the shoes.
Put on the hat of shame.
All right, let's try some more conceptual kinds of questions here. So, Davin, you're going to need to make up some ground here. Let's start with you again.
Okay.
So we see lots of modes of transport regularly, and we see some that don't come up so often. So warp drive, transporters, the occasional wormhole, those are used the most often. There are others that we see, and there's a race, the Iconians, noted for a unique mode of transport, which was
The gateways.
Yeah, I figured that might be a quick one. Dave, there's others that we see even less frequently for reasons. So Lore happened to take one of these. He had a fortunate encounter with a Pakled trade ship, which ended his use of this method. What was it?
Oh gosh, this isn't the transport conduits, is it?
Nope.
Oh dang. Oh,
We're gonna count that as a missed guess.
Yeah, definitely.
The chance to steal and really make up some ground.
I think I've misplaced which episode this is from. Honestly,
I also thought it was transwarp.
He did.
great minds think
He
alike.
did
and
later
fools
meet
do
up with the
something
Borg,
else.
and
Yeah.
probably
this is
did use
before the
transwarp
Borg. I was
conduit.
thinking
Oh.
this was the descent
This
we were talking about.
This was up until he met the Pakleds. It doesn't sound like you're gonna get it.
No, it doesn't.
So he was beamed out of a cargo bay on the Enterprise D and floated through space for 2 years.
Oh,
before
right.
a
You can
Pakled
float. That's true.
before a
That's
Pakled
true.
trade ship rescued
You'd
him
just be
from
really
the abyss.
irritated the whole time.
He spent a lot of his life very irritated.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right.
It's a creature of great resentment.
This doesn't necessarily. There isn't a firm answer I'm looking for on this one, so I'm going to give
Okay.
you both a shot at it.
Soft answers is what I'm all about.
Ooh.
Well, I'm only going to give out 1 point for the right one, so you're going to be in competition here. I want to see who can most impress.
Oh.
Oh my.
There's several possible ways to go with this. What is unique about the Bajoran wormhole near Deep Space Nine?
It's stable.
Okay.
It's curated by a non-spatio-temporal set of beings who have had historic interactions with the Bajoran people.
That sounds like a much more interesting answer to me, so I'm going to go with Dave. It is stable. Yeah, that's unique. Relatively unique.
Prophets.
We've seen others like that. We haven't seen others with prophets.
If the criteria is who can use the most words in their answer, give all the points to Dave.
I could have gone for a one-word answer of prophets, and that would have been enough for me too. That's a lot more unique.
Oh, that's what
stable
Grand
wormholes
Gazette would
aren't
like.
something to
Prophets.
shake your nose at here.
No,
true.
they're not, and they're a big deal. We saw that.
Big deal.
Midway through TNG's run, they did some heavy lifting for Deep Space Nine. They set up some stuff, including wormholes. They had their stable wormhole outside of some planet, and they invited everyone to bid on it.
Barjan wormholes.
And it was
the
it was
price.
stable on the one end, but turns out not on the other, much
Indeed.
to the
Sent them to
chagrin
the
of the
Delta Quadrant.
Ferengi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Who
so
we only catch up with years later.
many years later.
Yeah.
Fainting towards the Voyager, Dave. So this is a
Okay.
Voyager question. I'll give you first crack at it.
Okay.
Vice Admiral Janeway came back in time to speed up Voyager's trip home. Got him home right at the end of the series. How long did that trip originally take without her coming back?
I think it was, they'd shaved some time off, so it was something like 68 years.
Incorrect. You want to steal?
I don't think I know the exact many, but it's more like 30-some years.
30 is a lot nearer. So there was the 7 years that we saw, and then 16 more, during which great tragedies befell the crew of the Voyager and encouraged her to come back and speed up. So 23 years.
23.
Not so bad.
That's still a very long time. Much less than the 75 the series premiere predicts. But
I'm going to give you a half point for that one, Davin.
Ooh, half points.
Ooh.
I give and I take.
Yep.
Don't push it. Another one where I want to see the creative side of things. So I'm hoping for something a little better out of you this time. Davin.
Stable.
Pick another captain for the Voyager. So not Janeway. It could be any other captain that we've seen. Well, relatively well-known one. I don't want some chump who showed up once.
Jellicoe.
Good choice. How long does Jellicoe take to get the Voyager home?
The first episode.
Okay.
He just leaves.
I might come back to that.
No, it's like
no,
they
no,
stay
hold on.
there
I might
because-
come back to that. Dave,
Oh,
your
man.
choice. Pick a captain. Advocate for how quickly they'll get them home.
Oh, okay, a captain. Oh, shoot. I've lost the captain's name, but
-1 point.
they're destroyed
Not a good
in
start.
season 1, episode 25, and the
Also
ship
not a
that
good
Picard finds.
Huh?
It's, the one with the weird bugs that crawl in their necks. You know what I'm talking
you
about. Is it
mean
the Hathaway?
the movie?
No.
No, Picard the season.
Oh,
No.
Picard.
No. First season of TNG.
Oh,
Uh,
the
I forget the name of the ship anyway.
You mean the old guy?
conspiracy.
He's an admiral.
No. No, I mean the actual.
How about you pick somebody who you know their name?
This isn't gonna
You're trying to make a case for them.
I thought they presented
Points are
a very
racking up on
dashing,
this side.
captainly manner. Very
Before
Starfleet
bugs
sort of.
blew out of his neck.
Well, no, this is the Bolian guy.
Oh, the
Oh, I
The
know who you're
Bolian
talking
captain.
Oh, when he meets the four
Exactly,
of them
in the on the
Okay,
red-hued
that's-
mind planet.
that's
The
Captain,
Bolian guy. He's
Captain,
very forthright. I think he would have.
All right, well, you got a
just
lot of
turned right
ground to
back
make up
around.
here, but how quick is he going to get them back?
Oh, he's going to take like 90 years. I didn't
right.
say he was going to be successful. I just think it'd be great fun TV.
Starfleet's quotey finest. Don't break a lot of rules.
All right, I think
So
we're
Jellicoe.
I think we're going with Davin. How does Jellicoe get him back so quick?
Well, the thing is, they could have got back in the first episode, but Janeway didn't want to put the Ocampa in danger. Jellicoe don't know them people. He's just like, you're saying we can get back in like 10 minutes. Yeah.
But
What does he say?
He was pretty by the book
Do it.
too. He's the guy who got Troy into a proper uniform.
Oh, he likes propriety
He likes
on the bridge,
snapping
and
people
that
back
would
to-
remain. Kes
That's
wouldn't be
true.
walking on the bridge in like a little dress or anything.
that's true.
No.
Okay.
7 of 9 wouldn't even be allowed on that deck.
But yeah, they'd never have met her. And I mean, the Maquis would just be
Oh,
all
yeah, exactly.
confined
They'd
to
never
the
have
brig.
met her. Exactly. No, first episode, he doesn't know those people. He probably wouldn't even get into it. He probably hasn't even heard the story of the Ocampa. He's stuck in the Delta Quadrant from some entity, piece of technology he doesn't know. someone on his crew,
Old guy playing
his
a
science
banjo.
officer, says, "Hey, we can reverse this thing," because they did talk to the entity. But
I'm not sure that I buy the argument. I don't know that Jellicoe would have done that. I could see Cisco doing that.
Cisco gets them
Without
back
a
in
doubt.
20 minutes. But that wasn't the question. Well, I could have said Cisco.
You could have said Cisco.
That's
I'll
an
give
easy
you.
answer
I'll
for
give you the point only because it wasn't very strong competition on that one. Not to be offensive, Dave. But
No, that's all right. I floundered a
I
bit
could
there.
have seen better on
That's
that.
what he
I
says.
was,
He would
I
say,
was,
"Get it done.
I was floundering.
Get it done. Yeah. Okay.
Get it done."
Yep.
And he does break the rules. Like, he wasn't supposed to do that whole little play he did to get Picard back, like with the mines on the bottom of the ship. That was not by the book stuff. He didn't.
It's
figure that
true,
was
but everyone
something.
also commented on that being an unusual turn for the kind of guy that he seemed to be.
He's a complex guy. I like Jellicoe. We should have saw more of him.
A little surprised they didn't bring him back, honestly.
Ronnie Cox.
All right, you two are both pretty informed.
Do I get another point for knowing Ronnie Cox played Jellicoe?
Bigging for points.
Okay. All right.
All right. You guys are informed and know what's going on in the world. So there's a theory.
It's the slogan for this podcast.
You're informed.
There's a guy. His name's Robert Forward. He's got this idea of the weight calculation. Actually comes from taking buses between universities in Boston, but it applies to space travel in a well-known formulation. The idea is that any interstellar mission that cannot be completed in 50 years shouldn't be undertaken because a faster ship's going to come along and pass you, and you'll arrive to find that your job's already done and you spent however long in your sleeper ship not contributing.
Right.
Makes sense to me.
So clearly we're at that point now
Yeah.
in 2021.
Okay.
Starfleet has solved this. With what piece of technology, and I'll send this as a toss-up question, with what piece of technology did they solve the weight calculation?
Holodecks.
Why?
You still have, you're 2.5 points back here, man. You got to make up some ground still.
My suspicion is, the warp drive, but
As you've been, you're on the right track.
As we've seen in Star Trek, all great scientists get their best ideas on the holodeck. So I was thinking more creative.
So they solved it before the holodeck.
The Quizmaster asked for some creativity.
Would you not say that
So I was going like
that
three
Kirk's
steps back with
Enterprise
that.
had already advanced past this weight calculation? I'd argue they clearly have, and they have. They've said so in the series.
yeah, that's
And they
fair.
had no holodeck, so you're demonstrably wrong. The Warp 5 engine.
Style points.
Sure.
So
Sure.
they in the premiere of Enterprise they talk about we've been in our backyard. It's time to go out and explore. So the Warp 5 engine is what has solved the weight calculation for Starfleet.
And interestingly, NASA a couple of years ago published a short video looking at their sort of, we mentioned this I think in the last episode maybe, their sort of concept vision of an Alcubierre style warp ship. And their original proposition was Alpha Centauri in 14 days, which actually ends up being about warp 4.1, which is getting close to that. And it would be lovely to think we'd jump straight to warp 4 and like skip warp 1 entirely. Give
Talk
it a
about
miss.
begging for points.
So also in Enterprise, also in that same episode, they talk about they can now make it to Kronos and back because they've got the guy that crashed in the cornfield. They got to get him back to Kronos in 4.5 days. Well, now, exactly where
Tiny
Kronos
Lister.
is,
R.I.P.
exactly where Kronos is, seems to be a bit of a point of contention.
Sure.
First start of the left and straight on till morning.
Okay, for how long? Is it
Well-
120 light years? Is it 90? Is it 78? They don't seem to know. There isn't. I looked into this, and there doesn't seem to be a right answer.
740 million tessipate.
He already knows my weakness in calculating dissipates. My
He's
best
weak on the tessipate.
my best guess is about
This
68 light years.
This actually isn't a question because within the series they've muddled the answer to this.
Well, they sure have.
So in one of the movies, it looks like it's in a certain system which exists, which is about 100. They guess about 117 light years away. But then in Enterprise, as I just mentioned, they made it in 4.5 days there, and I guess 4.5 days back. Later in the series, they say, okay, we're now the furthest any Earth ship's ever been, and we're 90 light years from Earth, which would be not all of the way to Kronos if we took that as the position.
Yeah.
So it's not super clear. I don't think it's that big of a deal. It's over there somewhere, ostensibly in the Beta Quadrant, but
yes.
not that big of a
Obviously
deal.
to the left.
If you look at the way they're laid out, the Beta Quadrant's to the right.
Yeah.
All right, so
Good
weight
basic
calculation
galactic
has been solved. The interstellar travel is no longer an issue. Furthest we've seen is lower decks, so that's what I'm going to use as the baseline. What similar missions are being held up by technology as of lower decks? What's the current weight calculation for Starfleet?
Warp 10.
Okay.
Well, I suppose the other big weight calculation for them would be subspace repeaters that could then carry communications back at much higher than light speed.
Which is interesting. The original series touched on that a few different times. The neutral zone, they had to wait for instructions.
Yep.
So there isn't a strong answer to that. Warp 10 is all right. Yeah, that's pretty good. We've seen what happens when you mess with that in Tom Paris's test flight, and I don't think we need to revisit that anytime soon.
Nope.
Intergalactic is something that they haven't even touched on. It's never even really come up. They've got
Though
Reg
the
Barkley.
Tholians are an intergalactic species. They are not from our galaxy.
So there you go. Perhaps they have this fixed, and Starfleet doesn't yet.
Yeah, I suppose the only time they've ever gone that far is with the Traveler.
That's true.
Who
Out to
took them-
Galaxy, whatever, M33 or something like that.
Yeah, way out there.
All right, we're at 7 to 4.5. Now, lucky for both of you, there's like any good trivia show, we've got an opportunity for lots of points at the end here.
Warning. Last chance to be a hero.
Like Jeopardy.
That's right.
So these are going to go. This also tends
It all happens really fast.
to be. I think you'll definitely get some of these. So I'm looking at
He's
classes.
hoping so.
Dave.
Uh-oh, yep.
Please do not poke at the trivia master.
Okay, fine.
Minus 2 points.
I'm looking for the Enterprise. We've seen Enterprise. I'm not going to count the NX-01. I'm going to count Kirk's Enterprise, and we've seen up to the Enterprise E. The classes of each of the Enterprises as we go. So the original Enterprise was
It's a Constitution class.
right. The Enterprise A. Davan.
Constellation class?
Incorrect. Can you steal?
Enterprise A was a refit Constitution class.
Exactly right. Dave, back to you. It's your
Okay.
turn. What was the Enterprise B?
Enterprise B was no.
Ooh,
It was an Excelsior class ship.
nice save at the end. Davin, what was the Enterprise C? You almost just got the answer, I think.
Yep.
The Ambassador class.
That's right.
Narendra 3. Oh, Narendra 3.
Dave, the easiest of the block. What was the Enterprise D?
Galaxy class.
And the Enterprise E, Davin?
Oh.
Oh no.
No,
Oh,
don't
no.
tell me. No, I know it. It's coming out all.
If I had a
what's
timer, I
Mariner
didn't
say?
think I was going to need one.
Coming out all.
Do, 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 do.
All right, can
Oh,
you
I
steal?
lost it.
Sovereign class.
Sovereign class is right.
Oh.
Oh.
So that's going to be 5 more for Dave and 1 for Davin.
Yeah, Dave gets me on the ships.
Final
every
question.
time.
Final question.
I love spaceships so much.
You do.
Eventually, we're going to have an Enterprise F. What
Okay.
class of ship will the Enterprise F be?
I mean, it could be a Titan class.
Titan class. Okay.
Could be Titan.
One we've already seen. So
The Riker class.
the Riker class.
No.
Is that your answer?
No.
Oh, you've given your answer, the Titan. So a model we've seen, an interesting choice. I don't know.
The Federation class.
Federation class.
Oh, that's a nice. Oh, I like that.
I could see them doing that. It's not.
Trying to unify, doing like a rah-rah. We're all in it together, kind of.
Sure.
All right.
After the big strife, after the Romulans and all that kind of
Oh,
thing.
they could actually name it that. They could actually name it
The
a
Romulan
Romulus
class? They would never do
I
that.
don't think I could see that.
That'd be
Potentially the
Minus
flagship of the
3
Federation
points.
under.
lovely. Oh man. Joel and True, take
Joel
care
and
of our
True.
downtrodden Romulan neighbors.
I'll give you both a point for that, although I'm not totally blown away with either answer, if I'm going to be honest with you.
Well, we disappointed you at a rate you could accept.
We finished. Dave really cleaned up there. That's 6 points in the speed round. So Dave, you're winding up with 13. Davin will give you 5.5 overall, 6.5 overall.
This is an unexpected result.
This was a shellacking. So that's exactly twice as many points as your
Wow.
co-host.
Wow.
Well, I guess I shall have to eat my humble, what are they called? Icoberry torts.
Oh, very nice.
My humble
Very
torts.
nice.
And
Very nice. I take my victory with the Jackarai bead.
that's the trouble with trivia. Thanks, Mr. Scott.
Pleasure, gents.
Oh, lovely to see you.
Now beam him out of here.
Energizing.
So, I guess first we should talk about human culture in the 24th century.
Sure. We get a lot of interesting statements about human culture over the course of the various series.
Yeah, Tom Paris mentions that when him and B'Elanna are trying to decide where to do their honeymoon.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom's like, oh, it has to be Earth. And she's just like, well, why Earth? He's just like, well, Earth's the best. It's, got the cultures, he says. So what I could take from that is he's suggesting that all of the individual regional cultures that Earth has now still exist in the 24th century.
Sure.
Which is not something you see shown a lot in Star Trek with the other planets, sort of a homogeneous Klingon culture.
Sure.
That we see.
Yep.
It's same with Romulans and
in some sense, even in Starfleet, you see a kind of homogenized human culture as well.
Yeah.
Right? Because what they're really doing is becoming enculturated to Starfleet.
and the Federation culture, which is another thing I thought we could talk about too, is like the difference between human culture and Federation culture.
Yeah, because there's a lot of interesting differences. We see that human culture has a huge set of sort of tolerances and interests for difference and individuality. That's one of the things that humans seem to prize over a lot of other things in sort of the Trek sense of future human culture. But there's also a sense of self-exploration and exploration in general. There's a stubborn kind of explorer, settler culture that's developed among humans with different cultural practices themselves, right? And we see that in TNG. We see that in a couple of really interesting episodes of Deep Space Nine. Famously the one where Ben Sisko has to spend time in the box.
Oh.
Which is that episode reaches some pretty interesting depths.
Well, yeah, that episode explores the idea of starting a new culture.
Yeah.
On a new planet, random group of people, small group of people.
Yeah, it reminds me. There's this interesting sort of throwaway line in, I think, the end of book 2 or part of book 3 of Plato's Republic, where Socrates comments that really to start a new culture, you just have to kind of get rid of the parents and start with the kids, right? And he's like, and how are you going to do that? But the point he makes is that you'd sort of have to just get a completely new set of practices somehow and get people to buy into that. And it's not an easy shift to make. The history of Earth in Star Trek has shown that, it took the development of interstellar travel and contact consequent upon that with a real bona fide alien being who happened happily to come in peace to move human culture in a direction that has produced this post-scarcity culture of abundance where most humans don't seem to understand or really have much daily truck with the concept of money or transactions in that sense, even though there are clearly a number of currencies both in use in the Federation, but also outside it, such that the Federation sort of standard credit or something like that is a kind of harmonized currency making sense of the likely hundreds of currencies that exist within the Federation's bounds.
It's probably not very difficult to convert currency, if you need to convert it at all.
No, maybe
in
not.
that future, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, and the financial markets clearly exist because Quark talks about them, that sort of thing. But it seems as though the Federation
Talks about the Ferengi market.
Sure, but it seems as though the Federation sort of as a whole engages in those kind of negotiations. But now, this raises a question for me.
We learned all about the Ferengi market my 2 semesters.
On Ferenginar.
On Ferenginar.
But, somebody like Cassidy Yates,
Yeah.
who runs freight,
Yeah.
she does that for a living. So, I mean, technically, she's operating outside of Federation space. She's operating in the Bajor sector, principally. So, I think she must be working for a wage or be making some kind of profit on her freight transactions,
Well, as we've seen in a lot of Star Trek, all is not equal across the board, much like in our own world.
Sure.
Like, I think it's safe to say if you live on Earth, you probably have a replicator, or, if you want one, or your needs are taken care of. If you're on a Federation starship, if you're in Starfleet, you're taken care of a starbase.
Mm-hmm. But
You
we know
probably
it's
have what
different
you
on the
need.
colonies.
The colony's very different.
Right. And, there is very careful concern and question around colonization by the Federation, but it's still true that settlers can decide to get a group together and make a go of it. They don't have to necessarily ask anybody if they can get it together. There is a very interesting degree of sort of self-initiative on the part of the folks who want to move out and settle some world that nobody's lived on before. And that seems to also be a really interesting feature of human culture they discuss. But I guess in part of what we're running up against are the various
Colonizers.
ways, exactly, the various ways in which Star Trek has sort of self-consciously represented its own culture. When in season 1, episode 26, Picard says, we don't use money anymore.
Yeah.
We haven't done that in a long time.
Trust me, that firm is still going.
We've moved beyond the need for acquiring or hoarding up material things, he says, right? But in one sense...
You know what you need, Dave? A low-mileage pit whoopee. No offense.
It's okay. You just nearly made me do a spit take onto my microphone there.
A spit whoopee.
That's right, a spit whoopee. Low mileage spit whoopee.
Low-mileage spit whoopee.
Oh, what a great line. He's a wonderful character, actually. Just get me a guitar.
Yeah.
Me and my android friend.
Yeah, we're having a good time. I like the future. Play guitar with the androids.
But yeah, there is this sense that humans have moved beyond material needs in a sense that...
Some humans.
Well, and I wonder the degree to which for those who consider themselves beyond that, like, Picard, who articulates that as an element of his personality, how does he deal with the things he does keep? Because he has a Resican flute. Mm-hmm. And he has various pieces of archaeological treasure.
The Kurlan Neskos.
Right? Exactly. And, he also has... I'm sure collections of music he likes to listen to, and Dixon Hill Hollow programs.
Oh, no, wait, he
that
smashed
he
the Kurlan Neskos in First Contact.
Oh, that's true. That's true. He doesn't have that anymore.
He had a Kurlan Neskos.
Well, and every time the Enterprise goes down, he's not collecting all that stuff up to take it, to the escape pod with him, one assumes.
Don't worry, nobody's going to tell Professor Galen.
My saddle. I have to go back for my saddle, he says.
Every serious rider has his own saddle.
Every serious rider.
You
But
have
yeah,
to work it in.
It's my 50 mission saddle.
50 mission saddle.
But yeah, I mean, human culture seems to have prided itself on the enrichment of the individual through their experience. But I wonder if that also isn't a kind of coping with the...
And the greater group at whole.
Sure, absolutely. But in a way, that's a coping with the fact that one of their early drives as people, one of the drives we still work with, which is the sort of accumulation of things which represent a kind of security and a kind of storehouse for us of, favored objects or transitional things that we carry around to make us feel safe or whatever it happens to be. But once we shed that, would that not make those humans in a certain sense more keenly vulnerable to the fragility of their own existence somehow?
Yes.
Yet they all seem these sort of hardy, let's go swashbuckling type adventurers. Maybe that's the compensatory scheme, right? That you throw yourself into this exploration, personal and cosmic, because that's now the sort of new thing to acquire. That's the new thing to do is to actually sort of do things and acquire experience and acquire new skills and relationships.
I think that might be a Federation culture kind of thing. Because as we've seen on the colonies, things get a little more basic.
Sure.
Probably human as we know it now and throughout history.
And that's a really consistent note across
Base
all
level
the series.
human, perhaps.
Like
as Quark says, take the food from his belly, and
yeah.
a human's just as vicious as any bloodthirsty Klingon.
Indeed.
Yeah.
AR-558 is a beautiful depiction of that.
Want to just quote that episode for the next half hour? I'm fine with that.
Throw in liberal references to root beer.
Yeah, and then on Earth, where rather than being sort of this almost self-sacrificing exploration that you're talking about,
Yep.
it's more, at least from what you see on some of the clips from, whether it be Joseph Sisko or I guess almost holodeck interpretations. A lot is what we see of Earth a lot of the times, but
It's almost for visiting almost.
or even jokes like from Mariner on Lower Decks is like, oh, Earth is boring. All there is to do is hang out at wineries and eat at Creole restaurants.
But you're right. Like there is a way in which it's sort of it's a very gently domesticated paradise.
Yeah,
there was a specific.
It's more like Ryza than it is that Starfleet.
Sure.
Or that kind of Federation Starfleet ideal.
There's a
you mentioned.
specific piece of the Roman underworld. And in book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas finds his father Anchises there. And what Anchises loved to do, he just loved horseflesh, right? And he just loved working with horses.
Wearing it.
No, like just but I'm sure, of course. But and where he finds him currying a horse, right? And Anchises tells him, like, I just get to do this whenever, all the time, and me and the horse are friends. And like it's just this kind of perfect symbiosis that he gets to experience sort of as his afterlife. And in some sense, Earth kind of feels like that. And I don't know if that's always what Star Trek intends, but there is this sense in which it's kind of frozen moments in time that people get to enjoy. One of the things I found really interesting about Earth was the sort of shot over top of Boston that you get in that first episode of season 1 of Picard. Where there's still, like, you see there's skyscrapers and there's all these crazy lights, and it has a kind of a cyberpunk feel to it. But maybe that's part of the charm of Boston in the 24th century, right? That it is very, like, hustle and bustle, and it feels like a charming spaceport or something like, maybe that's why we're shown Boston in that moment, right? Maybe it's a really polyglot, multicultural place more than, say, La Barre, France, where lots of off-worlders might not have much interest in going there.
What are they gonna do?
Right? They're gonna
manage
watch
the spittlebugs.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, Earth is more akin to the culture of Ryza, I think, where it's not quite as hedonistic.
Sure.
Like that's a complete hedonistic culture for sure. Spend every day just committed to the pursuit of joy and pleasure. But Earth seems to be more the live my life and do what I want to do every day.
Yeah.
In that sort of my life. Like Joseph Sisko wants to
kind of everybody
cook in a restaurant. Yeah. He wants to take a walk in the park. He wants to listen to some music. Probably wants to flirt with a pretty girl.
Yeah.
He can do all those things, and like there's no real barrier to that. I mean, he's seemingly an amazing gourmet chef.
Sure.
But I'm sure on Earth, if you wanted to just start up a restaurant, there's probably not a lot of barriers to do that. I mean, people may not go if you're not all into it, but that comes to the point where everyone's doing what they want to do, probably.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know how things like rent or land rents or any of that sort of stuff. I don't think that doesn't seem to figure in. Although, you know, there are interesting moments. There are some issues of classic original series Star Trek comics where Scotty and Bones and Kirk discuss what they're going to do with their pay when they come out.
Right.
And honestly, I'm not sure how canonically those would be considered at this point, but there seems to be some sense that you kind of build a kind of credit with the Federation. I mean, how else does Ben Sisko buy land on Bajor?
Yeah.
Unless Bajorans have just been regularly giving him envelopes of cash because he's the emissary, which also seems a bit weird.
It does seem
I
that
can't
at least
imagine him taking that.
higher ranking officers, I would say like lieutenant and above, there does seem to be some sort of stipend or something of at least Federation credits.
Yeah, or at least some way
they
you
seem
can...
to be able to purchase things which they could use Federation credits for, but sometimes they have to use other currencies.
Well,
but
and
they can always get them.
Well, and Beverly Crusher, for instance, does that in the very first episode of TNG, right? She's looking at fabric when the Farpoint station changes its pattern to please her.
Right.
And she says, you know, bill it to my account on the Enterprise or something like that. It seems clear that humans still understand that there are barter or buying and selling interactions. It's just that when they really get into sort of human worlds, they don't seem to do that among themselves too much anymore. They still do kind of actions that would have been governed by those principles beforehand, but I think you can just I think anybody could walk into Sisko's restaurant and sit down as long as there's space to be served for dinner. I think you can just come in and order a meal because there's I don't think there's any money changing hands as far as I can tell.
No.
Now, that's really sort of Earth-centric Federation culture. And as we've said, you know, that will vary from place to place, from the collapsed, failed state of New Paris to the many colony and, you know, settled worlds that we'll see. But, you know, Federation culture is different again. And you mentioned that not only because it relates to Starfleet, but also because Federation culture is meant to be a kind of meeting place for so many of the foundational cultures, and then extending over the Federation's history that we've
brings
met.
me to something I was thinking too. I think about that thing that Tom Paris said about how Earth still has all these preserved cultures on its planet and stuff. But it's Tom Paris, so I think that he's just probably nostalgic for those cultures.
And he does indulge in nostalgia.
We're talking about Federation culture and how that differs from human and Earth culture and the colonies' cultures. I think that's probably not uncommon on most of the worlds that are encountered in Star Trek. They're probably not as homogenous as we've seen, because I think most of those cultures would have their version of the human and Starfleet Federation gap in cultures. Right. So what we're seeing as Klingon, Romulan, Cardassian culture is their version of Federation culture.
Sure.
Which is probably very similar to human version of Federation culture, because it's just that more militaristic, more exploratory, more scientific.
So we're seeing a sort of abstracted vision of their culture, much like Starfleet is a kind of abstracted vision of Federation culture.
I think so, and I think when we do get glimpses of these other planets, we do see that. Like in Picard, the new Picard series, for example, we definitely see a deeper and more varied Romulan culture than we were used to seeing.
Yeah, and I really valued those sort of gifts of the way that Romulan culture will sort of form societies in itself, dedicated to certain kinds of principles that are allowed to exist because they sort of announce themselves in their dedication. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. You know, that sense of the door and then the hidden door. The Koat Milat and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that was absolutely beautiful. and to me felt really consistent in some ways with the kind of Romulan culture that we've seen, say in Unification, parts 1 and 2, and a number of places where that's explored, that we see that Romulans like to associate with each other, and they'll form these sort of knots. And that one of the things the Senate is really concerned about is when those knots of little Romulan associations begin to show tendencies that would differ from the sort of majority governing opinion.
Yeah.
Right? But it's clearly a feature of Romulan society for a long time.
And the Romulans are a very interesting case, too, how they separated themselves from the Vulcans. I'm not entirely sure on the timeline, as far as when the Vulcans embraced logic and when the group that became the Romulans had their exodus from Vulcan.
Yeah.
But from what I gather, it's a similar timeline, like when they were all embracing Surak, or
That
the
was my
Romulans didn't
understanding.
want to do that. Because the Romulans, are, as they say, are very passionate people in the unification.
Yes. And there's this very thorny history on Vulcan, right? Much like we know from what we see particularly in the series Enterprise, but also a couple of instances of other visits to Vulcan in TNG and the original series. Vulcan is a geologically very active world, and it's sort of very dry for the most part, with the exception of a very few areas. And
Dry humor as well.
well played, sir. And that the history of the world in its geological activities, sort of volcanism, seems to be part of what is played on in depicting the culture, right? That there's this sense of an intense ability to produce artistically and technologically and industrially, but also these sort of early wild feelings that the Vulcans have, which in some cases are described almost like the gods they feel inside, right? These sort of titanic impulses are paired with these telepathic and psionic abilities that meant that the early Vulcans seem to have, or let's say ancient Vulcans seem to have waged a nearly endless war on each other that in Enterprise culminates in a series of nuclear strikes all over the planet in the days of Surak, which I think is somewhere around 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 years, something like some millennia ago anyway.
Oh, well, quite a long time. I mean, the entire length of time of Romulan society.
Exactly.
Probably.
And so the Romulans, those who are identified as marching under the eagle's wings, they won't accept these teachings and they won't abandon their ways. And so they sort of go their own way. And so there's this fundamental rift that's occurred between the Vulcans and certain aspects of their own history, which I think is a kind of symbol for the way in which they treat those old titanic gods inside, right? They contain them with logic and the teachings of Surak. They teach themselves to obey other principles.
Though it does seem the Romulans lost a lot of that telepathic ability.
Doesn't seem to be much evidence of that at all.
No.
Yeah.
Maybe they never had it and they were a group of Vulcans that never...
Sure. I wonder how prevalent it is among Vulcans, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure
that's
about
a good
that. But it's interesting how you take that one emotional but psionically powerful species, and one becomes a very reserved species, and one becomes a very secretive species. Not so different.
A different kind of reserve.
Yeah.
Yeah. But one that's based on a kind of innate or implicit guile or deceit. Yeah, very. I mean, the sort of twin cultures there are beautiful. And I think it brings me to the first point I was going to actually make about the kind of historical treatment of culture by Star Trek. When we first meet the Romulans in the original series, they're a really interesting addition to what's going on, because before that we've had these kind of sometimes somewhat caricatured pictures showing up as Klingons who are kind of the Russians in a certain way, with like Fu Manchu mustaches and unfortunate uses of makeup and all sorts of things like that.
A lot of glitter.
A lot of glitter. And the macro head, as Q would call it, remedy of later Star Trek, I think is really great that way. I love that change. But the Romulans, who are this other very enigmatic force, are in some ways very much the kind of an allegory for the real other, beyond even what they might fear about the Russians. What is this real other about? But as we get to know them over the course of TNG, even in their antagonism, we see some of those themes that are initially established in things like Balance of Terror, the kind of honor of the Romulans, the nobility of the Romulans, but also this
loyalty to state and family.
And a shrewd tactical and strategic ability that allows them to practice all kinds of tricks of warfare while still retaining their sense of, as you say, a kind of fealty and civic piety to the state.
We see that in the episode, The Defector?
Oh, man, great episode.
Now, again, I think he's a representative of that difference between Federation and human. He's coming from his kind of militaristic Romulan perspective, but he sort of has that love of home planet and love of culture.
Yeah, it's very deep in him.
And you see that in the Romulans a lot more so than you do with...
Yeah.
Like, you see a lot of loyalty to Starfleet with the human characters and stuff like that, but there's, other than Tom Paris, you don't see a lot of this... Well, and Picard. Picard's very into, like, a lot of history and archaeology and culture from a lot of planets.
In some ways, I think what you see with humans, you see a lot of loyalty to what they consider home. But I think about, one of my favorite conversations in all of Star Trek is Ben Sisko and Cassidy Yates sitting at a table in a Replimat. And all of a sudden, she mentions that, is it her brother and nephew play with the baseball team on Cestus 3?
Her brother, for sure, yeah.
And all of a sudden, Ben Sisko looks up and he's like, "You know baseball?
I didn't think anybody knew baseball but me and Jake."
And it's just, it's just the most beautiful, heartwarming scene. And
it's my favorite sport, but no one's played it for 200 years.
And, these people on Cestus 3 somehow have gotten a hold of it, right?
Yep.
I think there is a love of home, but home isn't necessarily Earth anymore.
You're right about that. Sisko's another one of those.
Because Bajor becomes home for Sisko.
But they do exist. But I guess my point was most of the human characters we see more just have this kind of Starfleet kind of culture and nostalgia, and you don't really hear a lot about what they care about back on Earth.
No.
Or wherever they're from. They're not all from Earth.
Well, and that's, I guess, part of my point, that there's lots of homes that wouldn't be Earth anymore.
Sure.
That people might be looking back to.
Yeah.
Even into the Arcana sector, where they were so beat up by Klingons during the early stages of what would become the Dominion War, right? When they laid claim to their traditional territories in that area. But yeah, maybe that lets us turn to Klingon culture. Now, Klingons, as we'd said,
Is it Nook-necked?
Yeah.
That's my favorite thing, that they don't really have a hello. It's just, what do you want? It's the closest thing they have to hello. What do you want?
They're awesome. Because it reminds me of one of the ancient Greek ways of greeting strangers at your city gates. You would just call out to them, "Where from and what wanting?" That's all you'd say. And if they couldn't answer right, look out. It's stones and javelins, buddy.
Yep.
And I can see, in some ways that the Klingons have that in them. They come off, again, as I'd said, as these sort of allegorical Russians.
Yeah.
In 68, 69.
They and the Ferengi maybe come off as the more one note of some of the cultures.
For a long time they do, I think.
For a long time. I think that changes a lot. I think certainly with the Klingons a lot in Deep Space Nine.
Well, and Worf's existence as a character generally allows us windows.
Yeah.
And the Klingon heritage arcs that Worf follows over TNG particularly allow us some of the best episodes, in the whole series. Where Picard is his Chadich, and all that sort of stuff.
Chadich will be silent.
Oh, man.
He's been waiting years to say that.
Standing out there on that big wooden thing, waiting for orders.
I do like when Picard speaks Klingon too.
Oh, yeah.
he makes a good Klingon.
His Klingon has some Shellyak notes in
It
it.
does, doesn't it? I was just thinking that.
So as once you learn Shellyak, you never go back.
But in TNG we see a lot of the more political culture of Klingons. And, Worf's kind of starry-eyed interpretation of historical Klingon culture.
Sure.
And of course, their art. Milota.
And scene. But yeah, we get a few glimpses at the more pacific sides of Klingon culture.
The marriage ritual that I love.
The hoop and javelin game.
Yeah.
Which is played in, what is that, Birthright? Maybe? Which I think is the first time we see Worf go through Deep Space Nine, even before he shows up there as a character. I like the conflict it brings up for him, because, these Klingons who've survived, while they're in sort of a categorically dishonorable position, nevertheless have retained a lot of Klingon values that Worf's had so little contact with. And, to me, watching that episode after I became a father was very interesting compared to before. Because I couldn't watch that episode after I became a father without thinking whether Alexander is on Worf's mind while he's on that world. Because Alexander lives so distant from his father for so much of his life, which in some ways fits the kind of epic Klingon fatherhood that Worf has thought about. Kahless in the mountains with his troops, not with his family, sacrificing everything for glory in battle and Sto-vo-kor. But he does, you're right, he escapes and he consoles himself with some of those superheroic aspects of Klingon culture, and he leans into them, especially in those moments of crisis. Like when Alexander shows up, Worf becomes super Klingon. Even more than normal. Just like when Kalar used to show up, he became super Klingon.
Honestly, when he runs into any Klingon.
Okay, that's a fair point. It's really not until the latter seasons of Deep Space Nine that he actually learns how to be with multiple Klingons at the same time and not just have a panic attack. It's
true. I am.
But you can see how he would have those anxieties. And it would kind of.
He doesn't know how he's supposed to act. He's trying. Yeah. He thinks he knows how, and it's just this kind of caricature of a Klingon. They all seem very. It's like Guinan says to him, "You don't act like other Klingons." Other Klingons laugh.
Yeah. Why didn't you ever offer him prune juice? But yeah, I mean, he's
speaking about becoming a father. My baby's first food, other than milk, was a warrior's drink.
Oh, prune juice. I thought you were going to say her first food was gah.
She wouldn't eat it.
Well, too fresh and it can scare infants.
But yeah, Klingons. Yeah, the marriage ritual I really love. I mean, a lot of their culture, I guess, focuses around Kahless and those epics. Though that ritual, I guess, goes back even further to the time of their gods when they slew their gods.
But it incorporates Kahless, right? And I wonder if it isn't something that takes a kind of definitive form with Kahless, but would have been practiced in forms not unlike that before.
The beating of the Klingon heart.
Oh, man.
Which Worf hears in that episode where he has to leave an injured Jadzia in the woods. And he starts to hear the beating of the Klingon heart because they have been joined. And they have one single beat now. Very beautiful analogy, I think.
Yeah, it's lovely because that's a moment where he really is very Klingon.
Yeah. True. Yes, he makes that choice. Am I a Klingon or am I a Starfleet officer?
And truly unapologetically so.
Yeah, and Sisko tells him, you may not be a captain based on that decision.
Not at this range.
Because you made that choice. You just told Starfleet that you're number 2 a Starfleet officer, and that's not how they roll.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think Worf would have known that when he turned back around to the jungle. He's absolutely conscious of that.
I think he went to Cisco. Was just like, I understand that you're probably gonna like court-martial me or whatever, and he's just like, I'm not even gonna tell them. Like, I'm gonna fluff it over. Like,
who do you think I am, sir?
Yeah, I know.
Oh man. But you know, speaking of Deep Space Nine, that is as a setting something that's given us windows onto a number of different cultures. You know, particularly Bajoran,
Cardassians, and Ferengi.
Yeah.
You're right about that. But before we move on to that, one final thing about Klingons their culture I think is maybe worth mentioning is the Klingon culture that we see in TNG and Deep Space Nine forward, really. From what has been said in some episodes is, especially in like Enterprise, I believe, it's just like that's kind of the aberration, and they weren't always like that.
Right.
Like he's just like they did used to value science, and like obviously they found warp drive, and like you look at the Klingons that we see in more of the TNG DS9 eras. How did that species organize enough and embrace education enough to get warp drive and all the other, seemingly amazing technologies that they have? Yeah.
And in that sense,
and great architecture and art and all that.
Absolutely. In that sense, in a way, they begin to resemble more the sort of developments in travel ability that presage the Viking era, say, because, those peoples were, they had always done certain elements of coastal raiding on each other, and they'd done farming and done all sorts of stuff. And you could see the kind of artwork, particularly the metalwork, that the Scandinavian cultures were doing for ages and ages before any one of them, say, sets foot on Lindisfarne in, the 800s, whenever, 860 something, I guess. And the...
oh, you know Linda?
Lindisfarne?
I've been to Lindisfarne.
But, that explosion of Vikings as a conquering force who, established Dublin and all sorts of places, and the Kievan Rus and all sorts of stuff, right? Which changes that whole part of the world, and they get as far as being the Varangian Guard for the Roman Emperor, right, at one point, because people know that these guys are hefty warriors, right? Give them that big Dane axe and look out.
Or Batleth.
Klingons, exactly, seem to have developed a similar kind of reputation for themselves, but I wonder if part of it wasn't that this culture, which has been able to get itself to spaceflight, quickly outstrips its own resources. I wonder if there wasn't some impulse in them that...
could have been a power shift as well.
Sure. A political change inside the ruling council.
The more military shift as well. Like all of a sudden there were these, groups with these powerful vessels, and they're not as united a military as we see like Starfleet or the Romulans.
Squadrons
or
will follow a powerful leader.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, a charismatic
it's almost
leader.
more like kind of ragtag gangs, more like the Kazon.
In some ways, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they'll tend to group and disband and band together. There's very quickly shifting loyalties out there. Yeah, and I wonder if that isn't elements of classical Klingon culture coming to the fore in the environment of the vacuum of space, where all bets are kind of off, and they recognize that fairly quickly.
Those ships become the Earth colonies, where they're becoming more basic Klingons.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And all of a sudden, they are able to. They have the disruptors on their vessels, so all of a sudden they can start telling people what to do. And so you have a kind of generational shift toward aspiring to this warrior culture, which,
it's a source to power, or like a path to power.
Exactly, right? And that's a different kind of move to a militaristic culture than, say, you'd find in Cardassian culture, where theirs was much more born out of literally outstripping their resources, falling into a condition of famine and plague and routine lack of fundamental resources and infrastructure.
Yeah, from what we even hear from, obviously, a lot of stuff in Deep Space Nine, but that's through different, whether it be the Dominion and other kind of reasons and stuff. But you hear some historical stuff as well. But in TNG, for example, Gulma Madred.
Yeah.
And he says when he was a child, how they just like struggled to find food. So it doesn't seem like for such a great space-faring power there always seems to be this struggle for basic needs on the planet of Cardassia. Mm-hmm. Like, look how quickly the Dominion and all of that kind of turmoil threw Cardassia into that sort of state. Mm-hmm. You don't think that would happen on Earth so much. Whereas you think, like, you know, everyone would still be eaten just fine on Earth.
Right.
Likely, whether it be their replicators or whatever. But they're so far removed from that kind of famine on Earth or Vulcan or
Sure.
Romulus.
Sure, yeah, the Federation is a much bigger, ultimately much more resilient political dominion than most of the others it encounters. And, you know, the Klingons have a much more fractious way about them, but the Cardassians themselves are, I suppose they were sort of meant to be kind of Ophidian, you know, kind of snake-like.
In
Their original design. And so there's always that sense of, you know, when are they going to strike?
Yeah.
What do they really intend? They're supposed to be sort of
are they hiding in a crevice?
Metaphorically kind of cold-blooded, you know. And their resilience, particularly to interrogation or other kind of mental or psionic disciplines, is noted throughout the series, that they have mental exercises and training that
telepathy doesn't really work on them.
No, it doesn't.
They remember everything. Like, photographic memories.
Yeah.
I mean, that's through a lot of training.
Absolutely. I'm
Through
sure
that sort of state-driven culture where you have to give them your teeth.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so they've developed, you know, elements we've seen in other cultures that have grown to that scale, where, you know, the Romulans have a certain kind of adherence to state and a centralized sense of authority as well. But the Cardassians do seem to have flung themselves into the business of space conquest because they were having problems existing inside their own star system as a viable culture. You know, and that could have been geological or hospitability reasons as much as anything, right? Maybe they got a worse hand.
Yeah, it does seem
dealt
like
to them in terms of
available
available
bit of a barren
planets.
planet. Like, it seems like it's very hot and rocky from what we see.
Yeah. And
but
maybe
you know,
not
if they're
easy to
lizards
grow
and
on.
snaky people, maybe that's fine. But like, still, you still need your food source, especially if you're like a higher society.
Precisely, right? And maybe that was always the problem with them. You know.
Maybe despite all their advances, they still never quite mastered the food. Like, you'd think they'd have replicators, though, and it would be fine. But
even replicators need some store of matter from which to begin, right?
True.
And that's part of the sort of culture of abundance of the Federation, that they can build that kind of proto-matter or whatever it's going to be into a ship such that plus however they decompose other kinds of normal wastes from the ship becomes how you refeed everybody, right?
Mm-hmm. You're saying everybody's eating poop.
And banana peels.
And banana peels.
Poop and banana peels mainly. Leftover chocolate cake. Leftover chocolate cake. Yes, that's what we'll call it. It's just leftover chocolate cake.
But yeah, I mean, with the Cardassians, like, cultural allegiance of state that we see even comes through in their art, and certainly in their legal system, where, you know, everybody's guilty, and then it's just a show after that to make everybody feel good and to trust the state even more. But even in their art with their, like, enigma tales, where everybody's always guilty. And
the stories
just
about
trying to
finding
figure
out
who's guilty of what.
Yeah, it's all sort of like origin story stuff, you know. But yeah, they have a very ritual culture that way too, you know, because they love their public displays of justice.
Yeah. And the repetitive epic, of course.
Absolutely. Generation after generation
of loyalty to the state. the pinnacle of literature.
I can imagine humans trying to watch that and going like, oh my God, it's been going on for days.
Somebody just go off the rails.
Where's the sword fight? Oh, man.
No, don't you understand? The last two generations also went into the military.
Yup.
And he's about to have children himself.
Who will likely go into the military.
I don't want to spoil the end of the repetitive epic.
Oh, that's true. Lest we repeat ourselves unduly. But that very kind of, that rapacious quality they develop with respect to other species and cultures is precisely what brings them into a kind of disastrous contact with Bajor.
Yeah.
And clearly not that long after they decided to lift themselves out of that position of destitution in which Gul Madred said he would have grown up.
Non-eternal destitution.
Right. Bajor would have been one of the stepping stones they used to do that, one suspects.
Yeah, it does seem that their interstellar colonization and early contacts were definitely more based in just trying to find resources. And that's very much, well, I mean, coming from the mouth of Dukat, who knows, but says why they had to go with the Dominion. It's just like they were starving, just even being left alone, like they were starving before the Dominion came, based on I guess the war with the Klingons.
And they'd just come out of a long, difficult, kind of slogging war with the Federation along their borders.
True, and Bajor.
And they'd left Bajor, so their fortunes had really turned in recent years.
But still, all these big giant ships, you think you could just cash a couple in and like feed your people?
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
War. What is it good for?
Oh.
So yeah, but out in the same portion of space are culture that have pursued this very, very differently.
The Zen Kethy.
Well, yes. I was thinking more about their neighbors to Rimward, which would be the Ferengi.
The Ferengi.
From their home planet of Ferenginar 10,000 years ago.
As you know, I am quite familiar with the planet of Ferenginar.
Indeed.
And its torrential rains.
And its slugs.
My favorite type of rain is when it's gleaming.
What sort of rain is that? Isn't that the kind of rain that stings when it hits your eyes?
Galoshes.
Galoshes.
I think I still have my pair of Ferengi galoshes.
Oh, I imagine they're considerable. We might call them hip waders. Now, Ferengi culture is notable, as we know from the episode Little Green Men, for never having really resorted to a lot of the kinds of tactics that other cultures have. They don't have a long history of warfare.
Nope.
They're capable of combat if they need to be, but they don't have a long history of warfare. Yep. Some piracy, some piracy.
Just piracy. There's definitely some
mainly piracy.
And a few eliminators.
Sure. You got to have one or two of them.
Yeah.
But much of their history is dominated by the development of their financial markets and their interstellar trading opportunities, which has seen a very slow expansion of their culture, but one which has steadily allowed them access to markets all over their sector, the Bajor Calandra sectors, well into the Federation. They may be sneered at and sniffed at by lots of cultures since their introduction to wider Federation domains, but they, I think, quickly make themselves indispensable.
Yep, and say what you will about, their unwillingness to defend themselves, as Nog would say, to Quark in
AR-558?
AR-558, thank you. But yeah, the Ferengis, though being highly capitalist, do understand negotiation and will always lean into that before any sort of conflict. And, say what you will about what that accomplishes in the end, like, maybe that makes you easier to conquer. Who knows?
Sure.
Or, makes you have to concede to more concessions you would otherwise not want to, or whatever.
Sure. But I think it makes the point that the Ferengi are not playing the short game. The difference between Ferengi profiteering and, let's call it, contemporary sort of late stage capitalism as we see in our real world right now, is that Ferengi have that history of a kind of 10,000 year view. They're not looking to completely destroy their source of anything. They're looking to find what's the most profitable, reasonable extraction to get that to market and get a steady revenue stream for themselves, as large as possible, of course, which is different than our sort of 1 or 2 quarter driven projections that we tend to work in right now, right? That's 3 to 6 months ahead at best. Yeah. That's a lot different than 10,000 years. Even a Ferengi lifespan of, a couple of hundred years means they've got a longer time of destitution to look forward to if they don't look to that stuff.
True. More nicely than the Orions do it.
Sure. I think in both cases, what would get under the Federation's skin is an approach to space travel which recklessly abandons anything like a notion of a prime directive. As we see when we meet up with the two Ferengi who go through the Barzan wormhole?
Barzan wormhole.
And we meet them up again in Voyager later on. They have really messed with that world's development, sort of beyond belief at that point.
Well, yeah, you don't want Ferengi to overly influence your culture.
And now, because we're in that part of space, I got to say, we've sort of danced around it a little bit. One of the things that strikes me about Star Trek from their introduction is how mysterious Bajoran culture remains. Because there are these hints that it's super ancient. What is it? Bahala, which was 20,000 years old?
I think so.
Like that.
I think it was 20,000.
And even older Bajoran
Yeah.
ruins seem to testify to a culture that's been extant on the planet for tens of millennia before the arrival of the Cardassians, and what seems to have been a general kind of rupture in their sense of cultural identity, but also their documentary history and their sort of cultural practices and techniques for nearly a century.
Yeah, there seems to have been a time in the Alpha, Beta quadrants where Bajor was probably the most advanced planet of all the planets and races that we've seen. Even, more ancient and advanced than the Vulcans and some of those.
Well, by the looks of it, Bajor was an old culture by the time, or had ancient cultures on it by the time the Romulans were departing under the banner of the Eagle to go somewhere else.
Not as ancient as the cities on Bajor, but almost as impressive.
Yeah, Bajor remains this beautiful mystery. And, in some sense, I think that's about the prophets.
Yep.
Who may well have been interacting with the ancient and then sort of historical Bajorans for an awfully long time.
The most spiritual culture we've seen a lot of in Star Trek, even more so than like Klingons. They kind of have their spiritual aspect as well.
Yeah, sort of robust nihilism.
Yeah.
we just killed those guys. They were weaklings.
Exactly.
But yeah, whereas the Federation seems to have largely turned away from. And maybe that's for the purposes of a kind of inclusive multiculturalism. They've made their
makes meeting other cultures a lot easier.
Yeah, they've made their sort of public stance one that's relatively neutral toward religious practice. The Bajorans tend to foreground it, and it's held them together. The assembly of the Kais, of the Vedics, and the Kai have held the whole planet together as a kind of government in exile in some ways, right before the provisional government set up. And they may be the link to Bajor's past and certainly we see that in the latter stages of DS9, where there's a documentary chain that they've preserved in some of their monasteries that goes well beyond and before the Cardassian occupation, and manages to preserve a lot of those texts in history. To their detriment at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, you have to question any culture that can produce Kai Wynn.
Kai Wynn. She just so desperately wants to be
Kaiopaka.
Yeah, and in touch with the prophets. She's one of those people.
Yeah, I mean, she's not a completely unrelatable character. She does just want to experience the thing that she's committed her life to.
Exactly, right? And it's interesting that her sort of grasping nature, which may have always been just sort of who she was, and come out of her own experience under the occupation of the Cardassians, becomes this thing that, to me, is the deepest barrier between her and the prophets. That she wants so desperately for them to talk to her is part of what the problem is.
Which is why they don't, they would rather talk to somebody who's not even from that world.
Exactly. Who's open to hearing what they have to say, rather than it sort of being about who she can become with this sort of access, right?
Centuries of misinterpretation and rewriting of whatever it was that they initially contacted to ancient Bajorans or what.
Sure. And I think that's
they
fair
don't want to
too.
deal with all that baggage.
But it's interesting in that respect that they pick a human Starfleet officer, right? And to me, that says that one of the things they're interested in is just that thing that gets under Sisko's skin so often, the Prime Directive. It's like, how can I be a Starfleet officer and the emissary? He's sort of a walking challenge to the Prime Directive all the time, because every move he makes is implicitly an act of Bajorian cultural practice.
How can I be a Starfleet officer and catch Eddington?
It's easy. Just get yourself a couple of torpedoes. It'll be fine.
Couple
Commit a
gaseous
few war
warheads.
crimes. Make the planet unlivable to humans. It'll all be okay.
Starfleet.
Yay!
Starfleet.
Ad Astra per Aspera. Yay! Oh man,
I love Eddington. He's one of my favorites.
he's a Canuck.
He is a Canuck.
It's true. Javert.
But yeah, the Bajorans. Interesting.
And they produce one of my favorite starships, of course, the Bajoran Lightship.
Oh,
Oh man.
great.
And I wonder, now that we've had this sort of talk about Bajoran culture, whether that wasn't a kind of fun experiment for Bajorans at that point. Because there's one source that says that in the episode
Just
they
testing
talk
their
about
art or their craft.
they
or their
talk about the
Dajaras.
design of this ship being 800 or 900 years old, which tells me that certainly the Bajorans had been in space well before they made a light sail ship. Because, I mean, you tend to go through a liquid rocket phase, right?
And we've seen
Or
other
some kind of
methods in
propellant.
Star Trek too, like tethers.
Sure.
I always
Sure.
like that idea for Earth.
A nice
orbiting
space
ship.
elevator?
Like a
Oh,
nice space
yeah.
elevator or tether. It seems.
Can you imagine? I mean, that would decrease the price of lifting things to orbit by such an amount that it would make space easy to go to. You know, who needs giant?
I mean,
phallic
obviously,
rockets?
there's a lot of wind and atmospheric turbulence you have to deal with in the construction of such a thing. But there wasn't that long ago when building a bridge to PEI was possible
Exactly.
through the rough seas of the Northumberland Strait.
Swells of 5 to 9 feet at most. Oh my. Actually, honestly, it can get pretty rough out there.
It can get pretty rough.
It can get pretty choked up with ice too.
Well, that's the main
pretty
problem.
crazily.
Yeah.
Or, as we would say in my native land of PEI, pretty choked up with ois. You know,
Put them oysters on ice, boys.
and come down east and see me. Those are still two of those directions that come from my native culture in that sense on PEI that I will always carry with me. Up is west and down is east.
Yeah.
Because that's how you go. You're going up west or you're going down east.
Canada's all mixed up like that, though. I mean, Upper Canada is actually
Yeah.
a low
Below
what we would call
Lower
lower.
Canada.
Yeah, below Lower Canada.
On a map, yeah, it's south of that.
Yeah.
Upper is meant in a very different sense, I think, you know.
Whatever
Always that sort of
whatever
political
direction you're
sense.
traveling up here, that's up.
Yep, that's true. You're going up country? All right, then.
Yeah, not too far up.
No, going uptown. Yeah.
Yeah, this podcast is out of East Coast Canada.
Yes, we are. Yeah. And perhaps at this point, we should say the arse is out of her,
The arse is out of her.
as they say. Perhaps.
They do say that. They definitely do say
do
that.
say that. It's time, I think, to close off here our first sampling of cultures of the alpha and beta quadrants. There's many left to go. As we know, it's infinite diversity and infinite combinations out there
Yep.
in our lovely Milky Way. We may return to this topic again and talk about some other cultures, pull in the episodes that most reference them. But for now, end transmission.
So what'd you get?
Oh, I got Roctagino and some Raspberry Pi.
I got a poutine.
Poutine.
Yeah,
Oh, man. That's a deep historical cut.
true.
Well,
So he likes the way he does his songs better.
Vic Fontaine.
Vic Fontaine.
Who's asking?
He says it's called the Vic Fontaine Show.
Well, fair enough. Come back with originals. He
Come
says.
back with originals. Okay. I mean, fine. Fair.
Well, I mean, he did call us pal.
I think he really likes us.
I think so.
Yeah.
When he wants us. I mean, he's telling us what to do to get up.
Or maybe He wants us to write songs for him to perform, and that's why he said, come back with originals.
This could be a whole new thing for us. Holovids, everything.
Well, we better get on that.
All right, let's get on it. Here we go.
Oh, my poutine's here.
Look out, that's hot.
I love the Replimat.
Oh, the red.